Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laurie Dippenaar. I'm the chairman of CDE. On behalf of CDE, I would like to welcome everyone today. We're encouraged and pleased that we have such a large audience online with nearly 500 people from all over South Africa and many other countries joining us this afternoon. Today's webinar is the first in a series of events celebrating 25 years since CDE's launch, which was in August 1995. We are almost as old as South Africa's democracy and very proud of both. Our job at CDE has been and is today to focus on how this country can consolidate our democracy and achieve the growth, jobs, and prosperity we desperately need. We do this through policy research and the active dissemination of our findings, analyses, and recommendations, and also through the many events we host where South Africans from different parts of our society are exposed to new ideas and alternative ways of achieving our common goals, and where all of us can learn from experts and listen to each other. Now, one of CDE's special contributions has been its ability to tap global expertise for the benefit of the country. It is therefore we are able to start our series of events, CDE at 25, with a good friend of CDE and a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer. I will ask Anne to introduce Paul and to manage our event today.
Thanks very much, Laurie. And welcome everybody to CDE Virtual. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Romer back to South Africa, albeit on Zoom. CDE persuaded him to come to this country in 2008 and again in 2010, where we had a memorable set of engagements, amongst others, with the then Minister of Finance, who had heard that Paul Romer was in town and encouraged a lengthy informal seminar with Paul in his offices, which grew and grew as more and more of his senior staff heard that Paul Romer was around and was running an informal discussion on jobs in the National Treasury. It was encouraging to see that the minister subsequently started talking a lot more about unemployment and jobs, which was a rarity a decade ago. A leading economist, policy innovator, world-famous professor, and a successful tech entrepreneur, Paul Romer was co-recipient of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics. He won this for his work that for the first time integrated ideas and innovation into economic models, making clear that the social benefits possible when people join together and collaborate in new ways. Paul has spent his career at the intersection of economics, innovation, technology, and urbanization. For anyone who knows him or listens to him, you will discover an economist who asks difficult and important questions about many of the things we all take for granted. He's one of the few people I know who can hold an audience for hours on the assumptions, ideas, and implications for growth of the rules governing traffic lights or the New York street grid. And if you listen to his Nobel acceptance speech, you will find a scientist deeply committed to the idea of progress and wanting to understand and accelerate the process of human discovery. You will also find a man committed to democracy and seriously concerned about how to expand opportunities and the quality of life in developing countries. I'm going to ask Paul to talk for about 20 minutes, and then he and I will have a conversation structured around a series of questions, my own and those we have received from around the country and from our partners in Africa, India, and Brazil. So Paul, with great pleasure, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. I've learned slowly with experience that every conversation involves the exchange of conscious thoughts along one kind of line of back and forth communication, but also signals about emotions and values, norms, things that we believe in about right and wrong. And I fear that one of the failures economists often make is that they attend too much to the conscious side of the conversation, not enough to the emotional, moral side of that conversation. And when I say economists, I'm including myself in that group. My experience in South Africa had a couple of memorable elements, memorable events where I learned that part of persuasion about the facts and the logic requires attention to the assertions about right and wrong, and a degree of empathy with people who might share beliefs about right and wrong that are slightly different from my own. Even though we might agree in the very large, we still might agree on the specific details, and this gets in the way of analysis and learning from the facts. Ultimately, the facts are our friends. This is the lesson of the Enlightenment, that if we know the facts, we'll make better decisions and we'll achieve better outcomes for everyone, and that we can establish the facts if we engage with each other in a particular way, in the way that has come to be known as science, in this social process we refer to as science, where people are transparent, they exchange their conscious messages about what's true, what's the logic of certain kinds of implications. They disagree transparently, but with respect. And eventually, out of those kinds of conversations will emerge a consensus, which is the closest humans ever get to the truth. Sadly, this legacy of the Enlightenment is at risk these days. If I think back to the 12 years ago in 2008 when I was in South Africa, I didn't then have any idea how much I would now feel that we're in a kind of a life and death struggle to keep alive this legacy of the Enlightenment, and to protect it from the decline back into a kind of a world of tribalism where emotions completely dominate, where there's no trust in the views of anyone who disagrees with any of us, and where if everybody believes according to that kind of world, but behaves according to the norms in that kind of world, it really becomes the case that we cannot establish the truth, because we just have a series of repetitions of assertions that are calculated for an end, that don't reflect any grounding in what we honestly believe to be true. So in the remaining years of my career, I want to, more than anything else, try to do what I can to be sure to pass on to future generations the benefits of the system, which has done so much for the world, and which now sadly seems to be under threat. The facts and the logic can be disturbing, especially when they undermine a belief we have about some specific issue that we think is right or wrong. And there's a humility that's required for science that means that we need to be ready to listen and be dispassionate, to even question ourselves when we're having a moralistic reaction, and be ready to return to the facts and the logic, and to understand that in almost all conversations, not all, but with the right group of people, we can assume that there's an ultimate agreement about the norms of what's right and what's wrong. And the disagreements are about kind of the details and mechanisms about getting to the shared destination. I don't remember whether I had paid much attention to the moralistic as opposed to the factual side of discussions about the labor market before I went to South Africa. But it certainly became a front and center issue for me, and has showed up in my work ever since. When I moved on to thinking about cities, where, according to my good friend Alain Berthaud, the way to understand a city is a labor market. It's all about jobs. To my work at the World Bank, where we were engaged in a series of discussions about how to encourage employment and what issues related to employment we needed to address. I could remember that it was 12 years ago, 2008, when I was there, because after the visit to South Africa, I made a trip to Namibia, and I woke up in Windhoek on the morning of almost exactly 12 years ago, on the morning when Barack Obama had just won the election in the United States to become president. So I woke up that morning, I watched his speech, I watched John McCain's concession speech. I don't even remember what the order was in those. I think John McCain's concession speech was first, then Obama spoke. And then when I had meetings the rest of the day in Windhoek, every government official I spoke to wanted to talk to me, not about what had so affected me, which was that because of this legacy of racism in the United States and slavery, it was so astonishing that we had elected a man who was Black to be our president. They were not so taken by that as they were by the really honorable concession speech that John McCain gave at that time, a speech which served that traditional function of ending the disputation and disagreement of the campaign and signaled this willingness to work together as citizens of a nation. That time, I've never felt as proud to be an American as I felt that day. And I've never forgotten this fact that the whole world is watching when we do things in the United States. And it fills me with shame to know that I live in a country now where we have departed so far from those norms of civility and shared interest and belief in citizenship and duty that John McCain exhibited. So the challenge on politics, on science and truth, on wages and employment, the challenge is to keep pushing forward, to keep communicating, to keep calling the discussion back to the facts and the logic with good cheer and with empathy for the people who disagree, and to do this even in a time when we seem to be moving backwards rather than moving forward. And I must say that I find Anne a true inspiration, because I've never encountered anybody who has been able to spend so many years working so diligently and with such commitment and good cheer in the face of painfully slow progress on questions of fact and logic, which, if we could agree, could genuinely make us all better. The facts that were most gripping and compelling to me, and that she and I have stayed in touch with ever since, concern the unintended, unfortunate side effects of policies which are designed to raise wages and improve the quality of work for people who have jobs, but which unfortunately reduce the likelihood that other people will have jobs. The underlying fact here is what economists refer to as the demand curve, the downward sloping demand curve for labor. And if the price employers have to pay, the wage they have to pay for workers is much higher, the economy will hire fewer people, and there will be many who would like to work who do not get the chance to work. Again, I think this was a set of ideas that emerged in my conversations first in South Africa with Anne, but this phenomenon of the person who doesn't get the job, it seems to me, is extremely damaging, and in ways that go beyond the lost chance to bring home income, ways that go far beyond a damage which could be remediated by, say, just offering income to that person. In the United States, there are people who speak of the idea of a guaranteed annual income in lieu of a job, as if this would address the harm that would come from policies that make it impossible for some people to have jobs. But the income itself can't make up for the intangibles of a sense of belonging, of a sense of contribution, of engagement with other people. But in a more practical sense, for young people, it can't make up the fact that work is just like school, hence my title. When someone works in a job, they learn things from that experience. So the benefits they get are a combination of both the wages they can take home and the additional skills that will make them a more productive worker throughout their career, that will let them earn higher wages in other jobs that they take after their first one. So, and if we use this idea of work as school, we can approach the question of what's right and what's wrong about payment in a work relationship. We can approach it with fresh eyes and perhaps come to a slightly different perspective on what is the right moralistic action, moral action in the proximate sense, given that we share an ultimate goal of trying to give everyone a sense of dignity, a sense of the reality of opportunity, and the sense of improvement throughout their lifetime. If you think of school as work and work as school, but school as work in this case, school is a kind of work that we ask people to do. We don't just ask, we require it by law, yet we don't pay them anything for doing that work. We do it because we know that the skill that they acquire, the human capital they acquire, will be better for them in their lives and will make the entire society better off because everyone has higher levels of skill, higher wages, and can be better citizens. So if it's morally acceptable to force people to do a rather unpleasant job, I've often said, I think I would rather work in a sweatshop than have to go back and be a student in an American high school once again. It can be a very hostile environment in which to operate, especially if you're one of those kids who doesn't fit right into the mainstream. But if we can think of school as an unpleasant job that we require people by law to go to for no compensation, then we can start to see that there may well be other ways to try and solve our problems in the labor market. Now, since first discussing these issues, I've become much more aware of the fact that there are serious problems with trying to use just private employers who hire people with a profit motive to try and serve this function of creating a learning experience for young people. There are many people who, with good reason, do not trust private employers and who would be, strongly opposed moralistically to the idea of making it possible to hire people at low wages, or even insisting that people be hired at low wages as we do in school. And we accept it in the school setting because it's the government which runs the schools, not the for-profit actor. We know that governments can fail and do a bad job just as private firms can, but on balance, there's a greater willingness to trust the people who work in a government than the people who might hire in the labor market. So I've turned increasingly to the view that if the way forward is to create more school-like experiences, transition experiences where young people would get some wages, but perhaps a much lower wage than they would get in the private economy at the minimum wage in any country, to create those low wage but real work experiences, there may be a role for government created jobs. In the United States, at least, this would hark back to the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was the program during the Great Depression, which hired young people, mostly young men at the time, to go out and work in the forests of the United States, thinning the forests, but to work in camps that were governed by the kind of the discipline of the military. People had to get up each day, they had to make their beds, they had to be well dressed, to present themselves, to be ready to go out to work. And as unpleasant as this might have been for some people, even though they did voluntarily engage in this kind of work, they learned things through that experience which helped them throughout their lives. So even as I try to remind people in the United States, in South Africa, at the World Bank, all over the world, that the impulse to force up wages in the private sector runs the risk of causing great harm if you push it too far. I'm no longer very optimistic about the idea of reducing wages in the private sector or undoing some of these minimum wages. But I do think instead, we might be able to agree on more cases where the government acts as the employer of last resort and creates work experiences that can serve students or former students who have left school, perhaps have not been well served by school, but work experiences that can help them make the transition to acquire the skills so that they will ultimately be better able to serve in the labor market and to be employable at the prevailing wages. I talked with the finance minister there about the other intermediate strategy of wage subsidies, where the government could make up the difference between what an employer would be willing to pay to hire an additional worker and what, as a society, we think workers could get. But here we run into the problem that governments all over the world are very constrained for resources. We don't have enough revenue to provide big enough subsidies to make sure that everybody gets employed at the high wages that we'd like to set for everyone. So I think as a matter of fact and logic, the temptation in at least the United States right now will be to push higher the minimum wage rather than to do what we should do, which is to force ourselves to pay more taxes, to collect enough revenue, to pay the wage subsidies, to make sure that everyone gets a job, but yet has the kind of take-home pay that we aspire for them. So faced with these revenue constraints and the difficulty of raising the taxes to fully support the kind of wage subsidy program it would take to make sure that every person in the United States who's willing can work, or that every person in South Africa who's willing is employed. Given these revenue constraints, I think governments, a government option, a public option, the government is the employer of last resort in programs that could be structured along the lines of something like the Civilian Conservation Corps. This perhaps might be the way forward. And I, like Anne, will keep trying to raise this issue, keep trying to open people's eyes, keep trying to underline that our shared interests are the same. We believe in the same thing about what's ultimately right and wrong for people. Our only disagreement is about how to get there. And that we do have to be aware of the stark reality that the measures we've been trying for decades now have left so many people completely disenfranchised, completely excluded, completely outside of the path towards opportunity and progress in which we should all share. So despite the setbacks on other fronts, on citizenship and support for truth and the Enlightenment, despite the slow progress that we make in public policy when we argue for the importance of making sure that everyone has a job. And despite the slow progress I've had recently in my attempts to get people to think differently about using tests as the way to end this terrible pandemic. Despite all of those setbacks and slow progress, I think of Anne and I never feel sorry for myself. I never feel I've done enough to keep pushing forward in good cheer to make this a better world. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, and for all the remarks across all the fronts. You've opened up a whole lot of issues for us to debate. Thank you for that. Perhaps I can start with this one. You've talked a lot and thought a lot about developing countries having limited state capacity and urbanizing with limited state capacity. And you've thought about some possible ideas to deal with that. South Africa is really in a very bad, weak position in terms of state capacity, which has been significantly diminished through a state capture and a whole lot of things that have happened here. So this is a very germane issue. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a bit about that before I get into some of the other issues.
Of course. Well, you know, I came to South Africa. I don't remember what you kind of floated as the reason for inviting me, but I came to South Africa because I was hopeful that it might be a place where one could try this idea of creating an entirely new jurisdiction, which could operate under different rules and which might therefore show people in the existing systems that something else was possible, a different way was possible. I was optimistic that it might be possible to arrange a deal where one said, in this new jurisdiction, that we would have different laws, perhaps lower wages, lower minimum wages, and without endangering the wages of the workers who are currently employed in South Africa. One could see how such regime operated, and one might get the benefit of creating employment opportunities that people could go seek in this new place without threatening the existing arrangements in South Africa. I very quickly learned from my conversations there that the unions, the political elite in South Africa would see a new jurisdiction which was relying on what they called low-wage labor, jobs that were not decent. They would see this as both a threat and as a morally unacceptable arrangement, one that they could not be party to. So I very quickly abandoned any thought of a charter city or new place in South Africa and switched to the conversation you and I have just had about how in an existing society, we can find other ways to deal with the large number of people who are currently excluded from work. So since that time in 2008, I have, to a certain extent, moved away from the specifics of proposing new cities, new jurisdictions, new places with new rules, but I've been watching for opportunities where one could reintroduce that idea. I went to the World Bank because I hoped there might be an opening there. And not surprisingly, my suggestions were not taken up, although I did get close at one point when people at the bank were grappling with the challenge of what to do in the southern part of Somalia, which is part of a country which was in arrears to the bank. The bank couldn't have any official presence. They were trying to provide indirectly some humanitarian relief into this area that was controlled by al-Shabaab. And at least at that point, I was able to get a little bit of engagement about, wouldn't it be better if we could set up a different jurisdiction in cooperation with the government in Somalia, provide security, and create a place where the many people who were displaced at that point because of drought could actually go and live and have a job. The fundamental problem with refugee camps is the problem that we see, we've replicated in other societies, of people who are excluded from the possibility of work. Although in the typical refugee camp, it's a matter of law that they can't work because they're not there legally in the country that is hosting them. So there was some receptivity to trying to do something about this in Somalia. Because of the threat of waves of migration that could be destabilizing into Europe, European nations are now thinking once again about whether there might be a way to, if Europe can't accept the hundreds of millions of people who want to leave the countries they now live in, could European nations help make possible the construction of new places that could start from scratch the way Hong Kong did, where people could go and have a chance to work and learn and earn. So I keep on this front as well, engaged, talking to people, hoping that options will emerge. But I have to say that I don't think that this is likely to be the path forward in South Africa. And moreover, I think that focus on urbanization, the details of urbanization, are unlikely to be a good use of time in South Africa, because ultimately, as I said from Alain, a city is a labor market. If you make it work, a city is just a labor market. If a new city or a reformed city or revised city is going to operate in an environment where the labor market restrictions exclude so many from the possibility of work, the city can't succeed. So South Africa needs to find another way to get people free of the restrictions that keep them from working. And I fear that as much as you and I would enjoy thinking about urban reform, urban design, I don't think it's the way forward to solve the problem of the disenfranchised in South Africa. But someday there may be places that someone who's disenfranchised in South Africa could move to, where it is legal for them to work. And were that to become a possibility, that might free up some new dimensions in this battle.
Paul, did I misunderstand? I was watching you and Ed Glazer having a conversation, and you got around to how you manage cities and privatization possibilities. And I thought I understood you to say that one way around the capacity issue in cities might be to look at contracting for services from other places. Yes. Can you talk a bit about that, unless I misunderstood?
No, you understood correctly. That if one were to create a new jurisdiction where one could establish a labor market, one immediately faces the question of who will appoint the police chief? What laws will the police enforce when people move to a new city? In discussions about, what would happen if the bank could negotiate a treaty with Somalia and take possession of a piece of land where something new would be possible. One of the very first things you'd have to do is contract in such services as administering the police force, which you might, ask the you know, the Australians or the Germans or the Dutch, anyone that you could think of who might have their police officials from a city or the national government take the responsibility of organizing and administering a police system. So this is a possibility, but of course, this has to be negotiated in conditions where the existing authorities are comfortable with some kind of outsourcing of responsibility for specific decisions. I mentioned policing just because it's such a sensitive one, but it does force us to grapple with how difficult this issue is. But one could imagine, you know, customs is an area where some countries have actually outsourced management of customs. You could imagine other forms of outsourcing as a way to bring in capacity, but this is not typically going to be a good way, I think, to build a consensus in a country for a fundamental change in something like its labor laws. You have to have the consensus domestically first that this is the right thing to do before you might bring in, say, some other countries that could, say, establish a more flexible labor market.
I'm getting quite a lot of questions and pushback at you about your faith in the public sector to, say, a civilian conservation corps or something like that. South Africans today, I think, have very little faith in our public sector, which has been corrupted and is almost broken in many respects. And so the focus here is more on the reforms we need in order to get much more investment, to get more private sector firms expanding and developing and getting jobs that way. And that you seem to be taking a different sort of position. How would you?
Let me just link these two discussions. I have thought about the possibility of some kind of external organization that could offer to set up and run versions of the Civilian Conservation Corps camps. It can't be a commercial entity. It cannot be a for-profit entity. But I thought, for example, if you take some of the labor unions, like the AFL-CIO in the United States or its counterparts in Europe, might an organization like that set itself up as an outsourced provider of the camp administration function for a country like South Africa if it decides we really would like to try and create these opportunities for young people. We know that what they learn in these camps could be good for them or bad for them, so it has to be done well. So I thought of the provision of these kind of government-like jobs as being something that a country like South Africa might actually outsource. But you know, I realized that even this would run into some skepticism and some concern. And I don't diminish the many other dimensions of opportunity for improvement in the structure of the economy in South Africa, room for improvement in the administration of the systems of government. And I don't diminish the harm that is being done to the economy in South Africa because the government can't provide the level of services that a modern economy needs. But I do, frankly, still always come back to this issue of if we can't get that majority of young people who are deprived of the chance to work, if we can't solve that problem, it may not matter what other problems we can solve.
Let me turn to something different. One of the issues at the World Bank was the Doing Business Index, and you had a lot of problems with this. Can I ask two questions? The one is, if you can briefly tell us the issue there about the quality of that index. And the second is, I think Ricardo Hausmann often argues that you might do all the right things in terms of the index, but the relationship between your place on the index and getting economic growth is not a great correlation. How do you see that set of issues?
Yeah. So let me take the second one first, and then I'll come back to the first one. There is there's some wisdom behind the idea of using transparency and measurement to encourage better behavior. So if we can measure how someone is doing, how a society is doing, how an individual is doing, and just publicize that measure, that creates some incentives for that individual to do better. So that theory is a reasonable one and worth pursuing. That was the instinct behind the Doing Business Index when it was first started. The problem is that it's very hard to get good measurements. Many systems that go in this direction fail because they start out with measurements that aren't too accurate, aren't very good. And then the stakes associated with those measurements become too high too soon. And then there's a backlash against high stakes being associated with how people perform on a bad system of measurement. This is what's undermined the use of, say, student achievement tests as a way to measure how a school is doing and encourage better progress within the school. This is why this program has come to naught in the United States. The Doing Business Index was a mixture of some measurements, which I think were reasonably good and created good incentives for governments to improve. But it was mixed in with those measures were some measures which I think were just frankly ideological, including the view that, for example, taxation is bad, where in many governments and many countries, more tax revenue would be essential to have a public sector that can do its job. So the Doing Business Index was a mixture of some reasonable measures, like just how long does it take if you're trying to open a small business? There's no good reason that should take 180 days instead of 2 days. That was a reasonable kind of measure, but it got mixed in with other measures, which I think were frankly ideological. And the measures that were, I think, most contentious had to do with the labor market because of all of the complexities that we alluded to before. Now, on the fundamental issues with doing business, the deepest problem I had with not just doing business, but with all of the research done at the World Bank is that the bank was not able to maintain the commitment to honesty and accuracy and integrity that you have to have in research. It had become bureaucratic. People had protected jobs. They were able to resist any attempt to hold them accountable or to just surface cases where they had done a bad job. So I ultimately came to the view that we needed to move all of the research activities out of the World Bank into organizations like universities that are designed to hold rigorously to these standards of integrity, because fundamentally the bank is a diplomatic organization. And diplomatic organizations are all about compromise and, kind of stipulated assertions that often aren't true. And there's just a deep tension between the rigor of the commitment to just saying what the facts are, as opposed to working together as a group of nations. So I came to the conclusion that I was wasting my time trying to work in a research department in the World Bank that couldn't maintain the standards of integrity we need to protect this system of science I talked about. I also felt that the Doing Business Index couldn't ultimately be fixed in an organization that didn't have that commitment to integrity. And so I think it would be time to just shut it down. I think it's outlived its value. I found a specific set of issues that involved these changes they made in the index just year after year that, without any change in what a country was doing, was moving the rankings dramatically. They've had another series of other issues that have come up recently. But I think the fundamental problem is a mismatch between the organization and the kind of the stated goal, which is to provide honest, trustworthy information.
I'm getting a lot of pushback on your views on jobs. Let me phrase one of the questions this way. Special economic zones, when you came out to South Africa in 2008, it was to talk about the Spence Commission on Growth and the key findings from that. And one of the issues was special economic zones. And in a way, as a lever for policy change, what would your view be on a special economic zone? What do you think the experience has been? It's a sort of more modest version of what you were talking about.
Yep.
And is that not something that one could be saying, let us have one experiment
Sure.
to test out some new rules and new ways of doing things? What's your view on them now?
Well, I came to these ideas partly because of my familiarity of the experience in Mauritius, where a free trade zone did turn out to be an effective way to reform an economy, shift it from the very high tariff barriers, the protected domestic production for the domestic market. By creating a free trade zone, they could bring in firms that were willing to hire workers into garment assembly, which is one of the most mobile sources of employment around the world. And what was a sign that it had worked was that ultimately the zone became the norm throughout the country. So you should think of these zones as a temporary transitional measure in a broader movement towards a change for the society. The problem we see with most zones is they don't have that effect of creating systemic change. They become protected enclaves. And frankly, they can create an entrenched elite, which has value by virtue of the special treatment they get in the zone as opposed to the rest of the country. They actually, the value of their assets, their land, their structures, their whatever investments they've made in those zones, the value there will go down if the rest of the country looks more like the zone. So the zone can actually build up a powerful elite which further resists, which creates more pressure to resist reform in the rest of the country. So I became less optimistic about the possibilities for zones, but this has to be balanced by the recognition that in some cases, like Mauritius, these have worked, and that it would be well worth trying some more experiments if people in context believe that there's a way forward that doesn't get trapped with special interests and kind of giveaways to the people in the zone. Well, one way I've tried to phrase this with people is that what we see in many cases are concession zones, where special concessions are given to a few. What we should do, we shouldn't do concession zones. What we should do, though, are reform zones. And if there's a genuine opportunity to create a reform zone, then it's worth pursuing it.
Great. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm sort of jumping around on the issues here because of all the questions. Let me come back at you with South Africa today is struggling. We have very low growth. We have a weak state, which is very difficult when you want to reform and your state doesn't have the capacity, never mind the will, to actually do the reforms. We have a very complicated global environment because of the pandemic. We have a weak education system. We have massive unemployment. So if you had a free hand, just sort of in general, what would you say to a middle income country? What should their priorities be if you want more jobs and you want more growth? How do you see those issues? Especially as we also have a fiscal crisis, just to add to the mix.
Well, I think, perhaps some of the opposition may be to the suggestion I'm making that addressing the problem of the disenfranchised youth should be the highest priority in South Africa. I didn't say that exactly, but I came very, very close. A better way to say this might be that I think as a goal, getting to an economy where every person has a chance to work, that we can agree that that's a very important part of where this process should end up. But the steps to take right now, this month, in South Africa, can only be judged by people who were there. It may well be, and this may be some of the pushback, it may well be that just restoring GDP growth is the first priority, and that this will help build a stronger public sector, create more momentum for reform, and then later one could come back and find a way to help create jobs for the excluded. So I honestly do not know what's the sequencing to follow in South Africa, and I suspect it will be very different in every country. So as long as we can agree that a measure of success has to be whether everyone, especially all young people, have a chance to make the transition from school into productive employment. As long as we agree that that should be an important part of our goals for judging success, then I'm quite willing to recognize that the reform path that gets us to that goal might have to start on addressing some other problems, and that I won't, from the outside, be able to say what the actual steps on the reform should be.
Great. Maybe I'll take you to familiar territory. I know you've spent a lot of time since the beginning of the pandemic thinking about what to do in America and more globally. And perhaps you could end with your thoughts on America and COVID and what should be done.
Well, in short, we have been stuck in the United States with a trade-off between either sacrificing lives or sacrificing livelihoods. Many people have tried to claim that we don't face a trade-off there, but the stark reality is that we do. The states controlled by Republicans, which tried to restore livelihoods more quickly, were able to actually have a faster recovery in employment, but it came at the expense of more deaths and a more rapid spread of the virus. So if we're stuck with this trade-off, we're just in a very bad position, the position we now find ourselves in. So what I've been saying is that we should invest in tests, and we have to make the fiscal resources available to pay for tests at very large scale. But if we invested in tests, we could find a way forward where we could both get people back to work and protect them from the spread of the virus. So it's a kind of an investment where we can calculate the rates of return. $1 spent on testing can lead to about $10 of additional economic activity. So we'd surely want to spend that dollar to get the $10 payoff. But unfortunately, it's been very difficult to get that done. And to be honest, it was because of the determined opposition of President Trump, who did not want more tests because more tests will mean more confirmed cases. He did not want the confirmed case numbers to go up because he thought it would reflect badly on him, perhaps hurt his political ambitions. So we'll have a chance with a new administration to take a new cut at this problem. I hope we will invest in testing as the way, and the way to understand this issue is that even in the worst cases, we only have a few % of the population who are infected. If we knew who was infected, we could isolate them for a week and we wouldn't have to isolate anybody else. They could all go back to their normal activities. The only thing that holds us back from doing that, the only reason we're restricting everybody is we don't know who's infected. The tests are the way to find out who's infected. And I'm optimistic that a new administration will finally commit to this program.
Okay, thank you for that. we were hoping that former President Kgalema Motlanthe would say a few words at the end of our talk today, but unfortunately, President Ramaphosa has appointed him as an AU envoy to go to Ethiopia and see with the former president of Mozambique if they can negotiate a ceasefire. So we have a few more minutes, and my last question to Paul is going to be this then.
Well, before you say that, let me just try and say that people who disagree with what I've said, it's perfectly okay to disagree because I might be wrong. And so let's, argue the facts, argue the logic, but also people who are offended because what I'm saying seems almost insensitive or immoral. I'm sorry if I have conveyed that, and I'm trying to learn how to address these issues without doing that. But please understand that I think we do share the same ultimate goals, and it's just an honest disagreement about what's the best way to get there. And I'm sorry to the extent that I may have offended rather than engaged.
No, I don't think you've offended anyone. I think there's been different points of view that are coming through on the chat line. So
disagreement is how we make progress towards truth. So disagreement is good.
Yeah. I'm told
last question. Yeah.
I'm told that you're the man who first said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and it was then appropriated. Yes. What were the circumstances in which you said it, and what were you thinking of at the time?
I actually used that in my classes in teaching. And as I think many people know, at least if you're from my age, there was an advertisement in the United States there was a fundraising call for an organization called the United Negro College Fund. This is back in the 1960s. And the end of the ad was this moving line, a picture of a young Black child, and a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So I kind of tried to use the resonance with that phrase and say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. There were other people, including Rahm Emanuel, who used a version of this and got credit for it. I don't mind. I mean, nobody should care about credit for something like this. I'm the guy who believes ideas should be free, and so credit is not the issue. But Rahm mangled the wording and said something like, "You never want to let a crisis go to waste." And I just thought, oh, please get it right because you missed the emotional resonance. I was actually speaking at a conference where Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, was there and was addressing the crisis of this threat of technological change that was going to displace workers, and was arguing that we could use that crisis to motivate a new round of investments in our educational system in the United States. But it is a generally applicable point that crisis is a time when people's attention gets focused, and when not always, but sometimes there's a chance to come to a consensus about trying something new. But sometimes, like the pandemic is just a tragedy. I don't see much upside that we can take out of this experience. So sometimes a crisis is just a crisis. It's not an opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Paul Romer. I think one of the key points on this vast terrain that we've covered is this concept of work as school, that just getting your foot in the door in a job, any kind of job, is actually a second chance for somebody in a poorer community who hasn't had a great education, that they have a chance to learn all sorts of things, from emotional regulation, I've heard you talk about, to other kinds of know-how and networks. And that's really a big issue that I think a country like South Africa needs to think hard about, and how we can expand opportunities to do that, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, or both. So a very big thank you to Paul Romer for giving us time this afternoon and sharing so many of his thoughts with us on this first in our series on CDE at 25. So thank you very much, everybody. And a big, if we could applause Paul, we would. So thank you very much for being with us for this hour.
And let me just say thank you personally and for engaging with me so effectively. I don't know if there is anybody from whom I've learned as much and who's been as provocative for me in thinking about issues as you have been. So I owe you a huge debt of gratitude.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. And thanks to Paul. This session is over.